Hey everyone, you're listening to Film Philosophy, where we break down the philosophies, concepts, and structures of filmmaking in the American film industry. We are filmmakers Tiffany Francis, Andrew Coles, and Nzinga Murray. Film Philosophy is brought to you by The Mission Entertainment. Today's episode features Caroline Renard, and the topic that we are tackling is film industry unions and its history. Caroline Renard is a first-generation Haitian-American writer from Miami. Before moving to Los Angeles, she earned a Bachelor of Science in African American Studies and Sociology from Florida State University. She just wrapped as a story editor on Disney Channel's Secrets of Sulphur Springs. We chose Caroline for this topic because she was a WGA Strike Captain on the front lines of the recently concluded strike. Word on the street and Twitter is that she has a lot of knowledge on our industry's unions, the history of it, and why today's strikes look so different from the others. All right, so welcome, Caroline.
Hello. Such a funny phrase, word on the street. I'm not a WGA historian. I am very much active in my guild and my union. I have, a little background on the WGA, but I am not a historian. We'll try our best for any of the listeners, but there's lots of information online that I'm pretty sure is way better than I am at explaining.
Appreciate the caveat, and we'll say this. So acknowledging that you're not a WGA historian, but we do want to highlight the fact that, as a strike captain, there's a unique perspective that you've had, and you can, speak to your personal experience, going through this most recent strike.
So the Writers Guild of America just concluded our long 5-month, 148-day strike that we had this year. Just a little history, little things that I do know. The Writers Guild of America, which consists of writer guilds West and East, was officially organized as a labor union on April 6, 1933. Before that, it was formerly known as the Screenwriters Guild, which was formed in 1921 by a group of 10 screenwriters, I believe, who were very much angry over the film studio's wage reductions, which is something that is very familiar to why we were on strike this year. So they formed in 1921. It was called the Screenwriters Guild, but it was more of a social club, not really a union. It was more of a place for writers to kind of have their grievances and talk about making sure they get their credits and talk about residuals and stuff like that. But it was officially formed as a union in 1933. And then by 1954, the Screenwriters Guild was one of the 5 groups who merged to represent writers on both coasts, which, as I said, is the Writers Guild of the East, which is New York based, and Writers Guild West, which is Los Angeles based. And that's the WGA as we know it today. But I also said that this isn't 1933 wasn't the first time writers were trying to figure out how to unionize and how to get a group together. Around 1910, I believe, when we transitioned from silent films to talkies, there was scenario writers. I don't know if you guys ever heard of that term before.
I have not.
Mm-mm.
Before we had talkies, it was a silent film, so writers weren't really considered an important part of the filmmaking process because there was no dialogue. And the scenario writers went uncredited. But then dialogue title cards started being introduced in the mid-1910s. And suddenly actors were speaking, quote unquote, and showing characters and having character arcs and development. And so there was scenario writers were being brought in to do those dialogue cards. And so then that's when writers and story editors discovered that there was a need for protecting their interests. So our union goes way back to 1910s. And like I said, that was mostly seen as social clubs and ways for writers to bond and come together and talk about protecting their interests. But it wasn't really until the 20s and then finally 1933 when it officially became a union. So that's a little backstory on the WGA. And 148 days was not the longest strike we had. It was back in 1988, 154 days. So we did not hit that number, thank God.
6 days short. Wow.
Yeah. Something that we always work off of is the minimum basic agreement, the MBA, which is something that, we've improved upon each year. Every 3 years is when our MBA or our contracts in layman terms is up for negotiations. That was something that was finally reached between producers and writers in 1941. and like finally signed into 1942. And one of the main reasons why the WGA was created was to make sure that writers had like, language in place between them and the producers. So yeah, 1941 was when we created the NBA, which is what we all use as our basic contracts. And that was officially signed in 1942. And this past strike is what we were fighting for. We were fighting for our MBA, the minimum basic agreement. So, yeah.
That's cool. I mean, that's very comprehensive. You're telling me and all this stuff in layman's terms, but like I'm like, oh, cool. I didn't really know that much about the history, to be honest.
It's a very fun, interesting. If you go to the WGAFoundation.org, it has way more details than I explained, but there's also so many different articles about just our specific union, but other unions in Hollywood, because the Writers Guild is specifically for television and film writers, but we all know that there's the Directors Guild, there's the Screen Actors Guild, which currently are still on strike, SAG-AFTRA.
Mm-hmm.
But the WGA was a model for the Screen Actors Guild, which also was founded in 1933. The Directors Guild was founded in 1936. So our union was definitely a kind of example of for other unions to be formed. So yeah, so if anyone's listening, there's so much fun information on our website, the WGA.org and WGAFoundation.org. Very fun, very interesting. Could probably make a movie about it, but yeah.
There probably will be a movie about it, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm intrigued because the producers don't always come out as the good guys, so I wonder if what studio will ever greenlight that movie because they're not the heroes. So we'll see if that ever does become a movie.
Well,
That's funny.
What I think is so interesting in just hearing you recount that history is to think about the fact that it seems like there's been a constant, in the history of our industry that there has been a recognized need that labor needs collective negotiation power, needs to try to leverage, their numbers, against those who are in control of the studios. And I think if we think about, how interchangeable writers used to be under the old studio system, where, you're operating under contract, again, if you describe it, it's like, wait a minute, that kind of sounds like an overall deal. But I think, the ways in which, writers basically made their deals, with studios were contracted, they sort of sat in, the writers' bungalows and just churned out projects. And so thinking about the lack of visibility of writers under the old studio system and thinking about the visibility of writers, in this modern moment with tools like social media, with tools like, different publicity, and the idea of the ways in which writers can be viewed with auteur theory, and the number of writers or the number of showrunners, particularly in the TV space, who have built a profile and a following. So, it's just interesting to hear. It's like, and we talk a lot about power structures within the industry and why things are the way they are today. And we always look for those historical precedents. So I appreciate you giving us a historical frame that illuminates this idea that labor in Hollywood has always been fighting for protection.
Yes, 100%. It's not just us, right? It's like when IATSE was formed, which makes up a lot of our craft, the craftsmen of our industry, when the directors and actors, it was all about protection from the studios. So it's like that, it has been the history of unions in our industry. It's about like it as like you said, Andrew, it's about protection, protecting the work, protecting the labor you're providing, and making sure that the studios who make hundreds still to this day, and even back then when it was the studio system, who makes so much money off of actors and writers and grips and directors and PAs, that there was something in place to make sure that people were able to continue doing that job, but like being treated fairly. And I think that's also just the history of unions in general, right? Not just in our industry, but all over.
Mm-hmm. I know it's an interesting year in that regard. I do want to let listeners know that today that we're recording this, it is October 3rd, 2023. So the strike officially ended last week on, I think, Wednesday night or something, right? Wednesday evening?
Yeah, Wednesday.
Yes. Okay. So just to let everyone know, we're talking about the strike as if it's in the past, but it's barely in the past. So I do want to say, the strike this year, I think, for the writers has been pushing for very specific issues that maybe we couldn't have imagined, let's say like 15, 20 years ago. I do want to ask you, Caroline, like, what do you think that makes the strike this year look different from previous strikes?
I think the reason that the 2023 strike is really different from the 2007-2008 strike is that the industry has changed so much in the 15 years from that last strike. And one of the main things we were fighting for was AI protection, right? That's not something that anybody, even all the way back to 1933, could even think about. Like, I'm pretty sure in 1933, when the union was formed, no one was thinking about AI because that was not even registered on anybody's mind, right?
Right.
And let alone streamers, like Louis B. Meyer of MGM, who's the founder of MGM, who created the Academy in order to like prevent unions. I'm pretty sure he would not have thought about the MGM founder would not think that like Netflix would be a thing, right? The industry has changed so much, and we're up for our contracts up, our MBA's up every 3 years, and every 3 years we have to put protections in place to protect writers. And so AI, for example, like I was saying, is one of the things we were fighting for, because who would have thought 15 years ago we had to tell people, hey, writing is done by human beings, it's not done by machines. Who would have thought that would have been a fight? But it was a fight. It was something where we were seeing it being used in other industries, and we were seeing it be used even in our own industries with little tweaks here and there with AI. And we were like, oh no, we need to put a stop to this now. We need to put protections in place now. So that's like something that makes this strike different. Another thing was back in 2007-2008 when that strike happened, streaming wasn't a thing. We didn't have Disney Plus and Apple TV and Amazon Prime. Like, we didn't have these things where we were very much just used to network TV and cable. And then movies went to the theater for X amount of months, and you made your box office and your profit and all that stuff like that. But then we've seen the rise of streaming, and we needed a new MBA that addressed streaming, addressed that TV and film now doesn't go through the traditional models of network TV or movie going anymore. Like, your films go now to Netflix directly, right? So we needed to address that. So that's another reason why this strike was different. Another reason why this strike was different was because, not in just our industry, but industries across this world, we've seen the rise of inflation. We've seen the cost of living going up. The cost of rent has gone up, and that's something that's affected everybody in Hollywood and outside of Hollywood. Just, it's become more and more difficult to survive and have a livable wage and be able to do your one job, and not have 50 other jobs, and be able to like have a have a living. We saw the middle class of writers disappear. Like, unless you were one of these big top showrunners, it was becoming more and more difficult to sustain as a writer. And so we needed to address that. And that's because of inflation and cost of living going up. And we also needed to address the fact that a lot of these practices that have been implemented in these last 5 years, with writers being paid less and mini rooms becoming a thing. Mini rooms is, or as they call it now, development rooms, where lots of streamers will have you work on a show in a development mini room before they greenlight it. It was taking away from like the traditional pipeline of becoming a TV writer, because 15 years ago, you would be able to start off as a staff writer on a season of a show, and then next season you work your way up to story editor, and so on and so on, and you would get set experience, and you would get mentorship, and you would learn how to become a showrunner. And by the run of that season, that show, that series, by if it was 6 or 7, you've worked your way up. There was a pipeline. There was like a clear path on how to have a career and grow your career as a TV writer. But then that pipeline was broken. And that was mainly because of streaming. And because that pipeline was broken, it was now leaving out so many people. And so we needed to address that in our new contract, being like, we need to rebuild the pipeline. We need to rebuild this pipeline where it's like, this isn't a gig economy. This isn't a job where you pray and hope you get the next gig, A lot of the things we were fighting for was low key just us trying to bring back the way that TV used to work,
Right.
And the reason why I fought so hard and I signed up to be a WGA captain is the pipeline being broken, and the people being most affected by all of these new practices were writers of color. Were marginalized writers. Like, we were stuck at the bottom. We weren't being, elevated up to the next position. And yeah, we just wanted to I don't know, bring that old thing back, make it work again.
It's so interesting, and I appreciate you, sort of laying out what made this strike, different than past years. But I think also giving the perspective of the overall climate, and the cultural moment that we're in. And I think, for the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic affected the world, affected our industry, put productions on hold, as many, facets of not just American life, but life around the globe. It's interesting to think about, the impact on these changes, technological, social, cultural, how we as consumers expect to be delivered content, and I think once you're hooked on the idea of, wait, I can pay, now $17, $18 a month, and I can have access to everything that's ever existed in this library, in this archive, and I can get all the new stuff. There have been such radical shifts in, how consumers acquire, stories and watch movies and TV, but also then this idea of, there has been inflation. Yeah, things have gotten more difficult for so many, particularly American families. And, to think about this strike is not isolated within Hollywood, but that Hollywood is a real place. Hollywood is filled with people who are trying to pay their mortgage and get braces for their kids and pay those medical bills. And the importance of, the WGA in terms of pension and healthcare, in terms of the benefits that it provides for members. But this idea of, there's a lot of working people who, collectively took a stand and said, the way that things have changed in our industry have made life untenable for us. And we're willing to take a bold action, to do that. And I think we're getting to that point where, again, union support, is the highest in America that it has been in decades. And I think, I wonder what it will be interesting to see what the ongoing effects of the writer strike, the actor strike, the auto workers strike, hotel workers that are striking around the country. Some people have been calling this last summer a hot strike summer. But but this idea of we are labor, in this industry.
Exactly. I'm glad that you also brought up that the idea that Hollywood is made up of real people. I think going back to why this strike was so different than, I guess, the past strikes is, which is not to say that, like, there isn't, the fantastical and kind of like, oh my God, we get to make movies and, TV element of this industry, which it is, right? Like, it is it's outrageous and bold of us to be able to make TV and film our careers, right? Like, it is, if you come from, like, I'm from Miami, Florida, I'm first gen, like, the idea that I get to make this a career for myself is not something that I can ever have imagined when I was younger, because it did seem so far removed and so far out there that, like, making make believe it could be your job. So I can see how it can seem like, okay, the people who make believe, make believe are not experiencing the things that quote unquote regular Americans are feeling. But the reality of the situation, and I think that's something that has been very much highlighted this year. And I do want to use social media as another example of why the strike has been so different, because there's so many writers and actors who use Twitter and TikTok and Instagram, which is something that, wasn't around 15 years ago, to kind of just really be vulnerable and tell their stories. And that then highlighted for a lot of people who, like me, when I was younger, didn't know anything about this business. And it told them that no, this industry is made up of real people, and these real people are suffering. Writers and
Mhm.
actors were being very blatant and very honest about how much they were making and how much residuals and how tough it's been these past few years. And I think that really changed this strike for a lot of people, and why people were like, oh, just because I see Julia Roberts and George Clooney, or that doesn't make that 90%, 90, that's 1% of SAG after. That's 99%. That doesn't represent 99% of that union. Majority of actors are working actors. They go from project to project, and they rely on their residuals, and they are not booking, and their union is there to protect them. And before the big A-listers were big A-listers, they were once upon a time working actors, right? Like, they started off
Mhm.
the same way, and they started at the bottom and they worked their way up to A-listers. And yeah, they're making the money that they, can negotiate their contracts and all that stuff like that. But like, the reality is 99% of the SAG actors working actors. Same thing with writers guilds. It's just like, you may know certain showrunners because of everything is very visible now. You can know the creator behind your favorite projects. You can know who a Shonda Rhimes is, or an Aaron Sorkin. Um, but before Shonda Rhimes was Shonda Rhimes, she started out as an aspiring writer, and WGA was there to make sure that she would be able to pay her, be paid and taken care of. And the reality of the situation is, I know we love to throw around the term nepo baby and nepotism, which is not to say that's not a thing in Hollywood, because it very much is a thing. But the reality is that a lot of us are not nepo babies. We're not, you know, we don't have uncles and grandpas who worked in the industry. We came from humble beginnings, and we wanted to be filmmakers, and we don't have family nest eggs and savings and stuff like that. And so we deserve to be paid our worth, and that's where our union comes in to protect us and make sure we have the minimum basic agreement and all that good stuff. So I'm glad that you pointed out that, I feel like the strike really was about reminding people that all the glitz and glamour that you do see of this industry, that real people make the TV and the films, the writers who are spending countless of hours in front of their computer creating the thing, the actors, the grips and the production assistant and the caterers and the transportation and the hair and makeup and the crew. It's like the camera crew. Like, this is all being made up by real people who are not millionaires. And this is why we have unions in place to protect their labor.
Totally. You're reminding me of, like, I think it was 2 years ago that the IATSE like Instagram was like blowing up about
Yeah.
all that stuff, right? And people
Yeah.
were, pouring out their stories of like why they were being overworked 14-hour days and couldn't have a real family, or had to sacrifice having a family, or this and that. I mean, I think like, we're seeing more and more firsthand stories shared through
Hmm.
social media, that we can understand why these rights are so important to people as
Hmm.
human beings, to be able to live actual lives that are sustainable and prolific for themselves.
If I can ask a question, I mean, I think you've touched on it a little bit, Caroline, but I
Hmm.
want to draw down on the point. Hollywood is made up of real people. Hollywood is
Hmm.
made up of people who, yes, are very lucky that they get to do this as a job, but it does require a lot of work. It does require a lot of
Yeah.
dedication. If we think about, crew members in particular working, as Tiffany
Hmm.
mentioned, 12, 14, 16 hours a day, doing physical labor, like there is so much that goes into making the TV and film projects that people really love. When you
Mm-hmm.
talk about the impact, that the changes in the industry have had, and how the strike is different, you'd mentioned before, and I want to, just drill down this idea of what the experience has been like for, writers and storytellers who come from historically marginalized backgrounds and who have been historically underrepresented, within Hollywood. Because I think everything that you're saying holds true for writers and creators of all backgrounds. But when we think about the systemic barriers to entry that so many historically underrepresented writers faced in making these inroads into the industry, I'm curious as to your perspective on the ways in which some of these things are magnified or felt more or in different ways, by writers from those groups.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. I think, I said earlier that one of the reasons why I signed up to be a WGA captain is because I signed up to protect the interests of Black and Brown writers and writers from other marginalized communities. And one of the main reasons why that is because the practices of the past few years that are why we went on strike has mostly affected Black and Brown and marginalized writers. The practices of mini rooms being stacked with upper level writers and leaving out lower level writers who always happen to be people of color, residuals from streamers and all of that not meeting the cost of living and inflation, that has affected the most writers of color. Making sure that AI protections were in place so writers of color weren't, the first people to have their works be taken advantage of by the AI system. Because we all know historically, on the chopping block of a lot of these things, there's always people of color. The lower writer pay and the fact that it's become harder and harder to get staffed on something and be able to stay on a show and learn and mentorship and go to set, from my perspective in the past 5 years, has affected writers of color the most. This wave of not being able to go produce your episode and not being able to learn how to make TV has affected younger writers of color. And we know historically that it's been really difficult for us to get in the door the way that our white counterparts have been able to get into the door. And all of these things that's happened these past 5 years where it's we'll get a show on the air that's written and directed by a person of color, and then after one season it's canceled, right? Or a show from a Latinx writer or a Black writer and it's canceled. It's just all of these practices I've seen in the past few years has majorly affected us the most. And we're the ones being left out in the dust. And one of the reasons why, if you've noticed, that a lot of the people who were signed up to be captains were majority women and people of color, majority Black women who signed up to be WGA captains and who were very vocal online and very vocal about, telling the truth on social media, were us. And the main reason was because if we didn't make the changes we needed to make now, and we didn't get ahead of this, because our contracts are up every 3 years, and it's not just us; it's every union in this industry. It's what's in the bylaws. Every 3 years, your contracts are up for negotiations. So it's SAG, it's DGA, and it's WGA, and then next year it's Teamsters, it's IATSE. They're up for an animation guild, but we have every 3 years, and we saw that if we didn't ask for these changes and we didn't ask for better, that it was only going to get worse for us, because writers of color who don't historically come from the privileged backgrounds or who don't have the family connections in Hollywood were going to be essentially priced out. We're essentially going to be forced out of the industry because they would be no longer able to afford to be here. They would no longer be able to afford to be writers because they weren't able to pay their bills or sustain themselves. And for us, we saw it as in order to make actionable changes, in order to want to see more writers of color come up, there needed to be contracts in place that allowed them to survive, that allowed them to be able to you know,
Mm-hmm.
pay their bills and buy groceries and have a roof over their head. Because this idea that you need to like suffer for your art and like, like this whole like poor artist thing, it's like it's such bullshit, like why
Mm-hmm.
like why do you need to be like almost unhoused in order to be like I'm a real artist, like it's not. But that's historically been the thing where it's like a lot of the reasons why we've been kept out is because financially it's not feasible for a lot of us to just pack up your
Mm-hmm.
bags and move to LA and become a writer, because it's like you have real world problems and real world bills and real world financial you know obligations and family and things like that, and medical. And for us, we saw the clear path that like diversity and inclusion in this industry was not going to get any better. It was going to actually get worse,
Mm-hmm.
because we were going to be priced out of this industry, because people were not going to be able to afford to be in Los Angeles, and people are not going to be able to afford their rent. And when you have those things weighing on you, you can't write, you can't direct, you can't be a filmmaker, because you're so worried about just surviving. You're just so worried about the basic minimum of things. And so I don't know if that answers your question, Andrew, but like that was one of the things we were, seeing that was going to become. It's been a problem, but we saw that it was going to become like a major problem, because the contracts and the rates were not matching up the realities of the world of that we're living in. And the people that are affected the most by that are people of color, are marginalized writers, queer writers. And that's why we fought so hard this year, because we know we needed to have contracts in place that allowed for Black and brown writers and queer writers and disabled writers to be able to survive in order to create.
Well, you definitely did answer my question. I appreciate that. And, before we move on to the next section, I think just the one thing that really resonated in what you said is the effects of people being priced out, as you put it, of this industry.
Mm-hmm.
When we, lose folks who don't necessarily, have the legacy of generational wealth in some of the ways that their counterparts do, don't have the ability to, survive on a number of years of low wages in order to break through and actually start getting paid. There's the effect in terms of what stories get told and who they're told by.
Exactly.
And I think, it's something, I think class is something. And Tiffany, I think we should make a note to probably talk about this, at some point in the future. But I think class depictions are something that's such a major issue in Hollywood, but I don't think we talk about it a lot.
Yeah.
Excuse me. When we think about the fact that a lot of the characters on your favorite TV shows, if they were actually working the jobs that they were working, they wouldn't live where they live.
They wouldn't have the apartments that they have and go to the restaurants that they go to. But yeah, it's class is I love that you brought up the people who get to tell the stories, because my thinking, especially with this strike starting, and when so our strike officially commenced May 2nd, but WGA and AMPTP were in talks months before that. May 1st was our deadline. And even before that, we were preparing ourselves for just in case of a strike, and just making sure that we temperature check with the general membership to figure out what their what their biggest concerns were, which then helped our negotiating committee go to AMTP, being like, this is what our membership is concerned about and worried about. And like you said, it's like, who gets to tell the stories and who gets to be filmmakers was one of the major concerns that a lot of us lower level Black and brown, queer, disabled writers have, was if this job doesn't continue to be a job that people can actually attain and survive on, then there is going to be a generation of writers that are essentially not here anymore. There is going to be a generation of writers that had to leave LA and New York because they couldn't afford anymore, which to me then means that there's a generation of storytellers and stories that we would have lost that on. and we would not have had the next John Singleton and Spike and Ryan and Ava. And, you think about that, and you think about, if people can't afford to make filmmaking their careers, then this industry is going to lose out on a generation of storytellers and stories that tells the real American stories, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
we're gonna miss out on people who can actually talk about what it is to be working class, what it is to be middle class. I said earlier, there was this erosion of the middle class in Hollywood, like the middle class, although our strike ended last week and things are still moving, things are not like all willy-nilly, everything's, rainbows and we're all happy. SAG is still on strike, and it's going to take a minute for things to start, coming back up. But one of the problems is, it was the erosion of the middle class of Hollywood, and it was just like the haves and the have-nots. And unfortunately, the haves-nots were being kind of pushed out of the industry. And then that trickles down to, like, well, then we're not having these interesting stories, or we're not having these interesting, like, imagine if we don't start fixing the problems, like, who's the next Barry Jenkins who's going to be able to tell an authentic story about, young Black boy from Miami? He's going to be back in Miami because he can't afford to live in LA.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, who's gonna, like, we have to make sure, which is another reason why I think this strike was so different for a lot of us. It's like, not only for ourselves and us as future filmmakers who are coming up, and we're a few years into the union, and we're a few years into our jobs, and we're a few years as filmmakers. We're also thinking about the next generation of writers, and we want to make sure that this industry is sustainable for them, because it's like, we're going to be missing out on their stories. And that's going to be, to me, one of the saddest things, because it's like, we're just going to have the same old people trying to tell Black and brown
Mm-hmm.
stories and queer stories, and like,
Yeah.
because the people who need to be telling it, they broke, they poor, they can't.
Man, I am truly moved by the spirit of what you're saying, because it certainly would be a huge tragedy to lose out on these beautiful, diverse stories that actually a lot of them haven't yet been told, and they need to be told, right? And I hope we continue to see more and more beautiful, diverse, interesting stories that we just haven't seen yet. And we need that. We need that so much. And
Yeah,
that's why
I'm
we're in
hope
it.
yeah, and I'm hoping that now, with our new contract in place, and of course, we're always going to improve upon our contract in the next 3 years, when we go back to the table and just make it better and better, and make these careers sustainable for people, that we do open the doors for more people, because now it's an actual viable career again for people. And we then do have these diverse storytellers telling their own personal stories.
Thank you so much for talking about all of that and laying it out for us. I do want to know, from your point of view, the strikes this year, I think, obviously it's been different. It's also been, alongside the SAG strike. What do you think will be the impact of all of this long term now that it is over, or for the writers at least? And do you think they're going to be bring about positive changes? What do you think are the big long term picture, moments for this?
I will say, for me, I'm hoping, we know SAG is still on strike, and they went back to the negotiation table yesterday, which is the second for anyone who is listening to this later. And one, we're hoping that our deal and our strike and our tenacity inspires them to, go back to that table and fight for what they need. And then we're hoping that our strike and our deal inspires the every other union in this industry when they go to negotiation tables with AMPTP, IATSE, Teamsters, Animation, who were all so instrumental to making our strike so powerful. We're hoping this gives them the leverage that they need to then go to that negotiating table with them and demand what they need for their specific union. It's like a rising tide raises all ships type of analogy. So it's like that's one of the major reasons I feel like a lot of us went so hard this year with this negotiations and these strikes was we really want people to understand that like it wasn't just about us. It was about every labor in this industry, knowing that they too had the right to go and demand their worth and that they can ask for what they deserve and hopefully they can pattern themselves after our union. And then another thing I'm hoping is that we're only a week out of being out of strike and slowly everyone's going back to work. But something that and we spoke about this a little bit early before we hit record and actually before you got on, Andrew, something I noticed is a lot of writers are paying attention more to their business, their contracts, their branding, where it's like, I know it's easy for a lot of us to just be like, well, I'm an artist. I don't really need to pay attention to numbers and contracts and stuff like that. But I've noticed in the past week that like a lot of writers are they know their worth after 5 months of being on strike. They understand that it starts with their scripts. It starts with their ideas and their world and the characters that they build, and that they do have the right to demand more and ask for more. And so I've seen a lot of writers, kind of going back to their reps and the projects that were probably in development pre-strike and being like, hey, like we're going to do things different now. I'm actually very well versed in my contract and I know what I'm worth and I know what I'm not going to take anymore. And all of that, I hope, boils down to everyone knowing what they bring to the table and fighting for their worth. And then I hope that just then circulate all over this industry where it's like people taking care of each other, community, which then hopefully breeds people knowing that like this is a industry that takes care of each other, that breeds positivity, which then allows people to actually be filmmakers and storytellers, and they don't have to worry about all the other nonsense. And if people are being taken care of and they're not being overworked and they're being paid their worth, like a set is a healthy and happy place where we're getting to make film and TV, and it doesn't need to be toxic, and it doesn't need to be abusive, and it doesn't need to be all these other things that we've experienced and Hollywood has been, that we can start changing those tides, right? Where it's like everybody on set's taken care of. Everyone on set's paid their worth. Everybody on set works proper hours. Everyone on set, it's like we're making movie and TV. We're not saving lives, but in order to make that, we don't need to be cruel about it. We don't need to be. It doesn't need to be nasty. It can be like, no, we made a movie on a set where everyone was happy, healthy, got paid well, worked good hours, and we created a project, and it breeds room for people who never thought that they could do this. They now know that they can. So that's what I'm hoping, like it trickles down to everybody else, and then we slowly just start letting people know that like, hey, you don't have to work 20 hours a day for minimum wage on the set. Like you deserve more. You deserve more. You earned more, and you get to do what you want without being abused.
I think I really love that, and I think it's an important point to note that there is a trickle-down effect to changes and evolutions within our industry. So if we think about, again, what, the Me Too movement, exposed about the ways in which there were, unsafe and predatory, working environments for a lot of women, within Hollywood throughout the history of this industry, then we started to tackle and look at, well, what other types of behavior are unacceptable? And if we think
Yeah.
about the number of people in positions of power that have been ousted from those positions of power because they proved themselves to be unworthy stewards over, over wielding power and responsibility over other people, of being team leaders,
Hmm.
like there's not enough leadership training in our industry. People are
Yes.
placed in positions of power where they have a staff, they have crew working for them, they are responsible for millions upon millions of dollars in investment by these studios and streamers. Yet these studios and streamers have not really taken it to their account to say, do we have a training system in place to make sure that people are not only able to do the jobs that we're putting them in these positions of power for, but also going to be good stewards over it and create a safe working environment that ultimately will lead to a better product. And it's like, I salute the
Yes.
WGA for their work in the showrunners training program, and I think some of the guild initiatives. But I just think it's a really important point that you're making, and we've seen it in the last couple of years of changes in our industry, that if you start to question the status quo, if you start to ask for more and you were able to achieve those goals, then you start
Hmm.
to see a trickle-down effect or a blossoming effect that you couldn't have necessarily anticipated.
Yep.
And I think that's really exciting, because as much as we talk about what's wrong with our industry or the ways in which our industry has been historically and systemically broken, we also do want to, look forward and say, what are the ways in which our industry can change? What are the positive effects that are coming down? What are changes and solutions? We refuse to
Yeah.
accept that we are in a static place. And while change is difficult to advocate for, I think with the gains that the WGA fought for and earned, in this latest strike, hopefully, the gains that SAG-AFTRA will make in terms of their strike and
Hmm.
whatever, whenever that resolves, it's a very exciting moment to think about the possibilities of where our industry can go. And
Exactly.
just an invitation for you is, as you think about where we are in this moment and, the importance of unions, the importance of collective bargaining, the importance of communal uplift, what are some of the ways in which you see change on the horizon, or some thoughts as to how we can continue to push our industry to know better and do better when it comes to labor demands, when it comes to working conditions, when it comes to the pipeline for talent? But curious to hear, what you are optimistic and hopeful about in terms of the changes that you are seeing and hope to see.
Some of the things I've already seen happening is, 148 days out on the line with a bunch of writers, we talk. And I feel like there was really a big community that was built. And there was a lot of people who, for all intents and purposes, were a little far removed from what a lot of lower level writers were going through, even support staff was going through. And because a lot of us were very vocal and honest about what the industry has been for us, especially as marginalized writers for the past and filmmakers for the past 5 years, you have a lot of people at the top who were really listening and really being like, I didn't know it was this bad for a lot of people, and I'm going to be a part of the change. So that's some of the immediate changes I've already started seeing, where it's like, there's been a real big community that has formed, because it's, when you're out there 148 days in the sun and you're just talking and walking, you got your signs up, you got a lot of people who really are like, hey, IFCON deals are bad and you don't have to do free work. And you had the union, really emphasize to us a lot, being like, hey, like, come to us if there's an issue. And a lot of people being like, okay, coming to, so I've seen those immediate changes where people in power, like the showrunners and producers and people, being like, I vow to be a change and I vow to make things better.
Mm.
Another thing is, one of the things we were fighting for was room minimums, where, you know, part of the things that we've had to deal with these past few years, like I said, was with mini rooms and development rooms, where a lot of the people who were being hired for those rooms, it was very small, very inclusive, and it shut out a lot of writers because it was always very top heavy. It was upper level writers, and and unfortunately, majority of upper level writers in this industry are white cis hetero men, and so that was leaving out a lot of marginalized writers. But because now with the room minimums, not maximums, minimums, that hopefully is going to open the doors once again for lower level and mid-level writers who happen to always be people of color and women and marginalized and queer writers. That will then hopefully bring back the writers room, like save the writers room, and that will open the doors for writers of color to, you know, be able to stay and build upon their career, and like they won't get stuck at the staff level, writer level. They won't get stuck at story editor and have to repeat level some things that we've had to endure for a while. So I'm hoping that the room minimums opens the door again for people and allow writers of colors to come through. And just so those are some of like the immediate things I've been seeing and I'm hopeful about, like, and just that, with our minimums and residuals and all that stuff like that, that will, start taking effect when the contract's ratified and people can start being able to like financially survive and then focus on their work. And long term, I'm really just hoping that long term, I feel like this strike really brought about a lot of future leaders, people that, for me, who, before the strike just was, they were just writers. They were doing their thing. They really didn't have any ambitions beyond that. But from my POV, I saw a lot of labor activists be born in this strike. I saw a lot of people who 5 months ago would not consider themselves activists, would not consider themselves labor movement activists, would not consider themselves people who push the status quo, would not consider themselves people who, colored outside the line. But in these past 5 months, I've seen so many people from across this industry rise up, accept the challenge, become activists, are so vocal about fighting not only for our union, but everybody in this industry. And not only this industry, but like you said earlier, like it really was a strike summer. I've seen our union go out and stand in solidarity with the Teamsters, with the hotel workers. When the teachers had their one day, the teachers union had their one day walkout, with the auto workers. And we showed up for them just the way they showed up for us. I'm hoping that energy that I saw and those people I saw rise to the top these past 5 months, that continues even past this strike and even past SAG after strike and even into 2024 when all the other unions are up for their contract negotiations. And that starts trickling down into fighting for, hey, you know what? I am a leader. I can demand things and I can fight for things. That my room is going to be more inclusive. My set is going to be more inclusive. I am going to hire more actors of color. I am going to have more, I'm going to have a DP of color. I'm going to have a woman DP. Like, I'm hoping all of that trickles down to people being like, hey, the status quo is no longer the status quo. We do not have to abide by just because things have been this way. We don't have to continue doing that. And that is my hope for the future, is that people know that they know their worth and know that they can fight for themselves and other people. And I've seen that this past 5 months, and I want everyone to hold on to that community that we have. There were so many times in this strike where which is, something that is also different from the 2007 2008 strike. I saw so many people who just stepped up to the plate. I have one friend, Joelle Garfunkel, who was a strike captain at Radford, and she saw there was a need, and she created the Green Envelope Fund, which raised so much money for everybody across this industry, not just writers, but people who needed money for groceries. We had the Entertainment Fund, the Actors Fund. So many people donated, so many people taking care of each other that, like, yeah, we were on strike for 5 months, but we had people, the top 1%, people who were even in the top 1%, but people raising money, people donating, people taking care of each other. That to me was the biggest thing I took out of this strike, is the fact that so many people stepped up and was like, I may not have much, or I'm not like we're going to take care of each other. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
I saw so many people like 5 months ago who were like, no, like, I'm not this person, suddenly turn into these labor activists and who are like, screw the studios. We have each other's back. We're going to take care of each other. We're going to feed each other. We're going to, like there were so many initiatives started where people were like, this grocery fund and the entertainment fund, like all of these things where it's like people Venmoing people money just to be like, hey, you need to eat this week,
Mm-hmm.
and
Wow.
I'm hoping that and it's still going on today. Like yesterday I was at the SAG after strike, and it was the WGA Day of Solidarity. It was like our strike ended last week, and yet we all still showed up yesterday in our blue shirts with our picket signs to support SAG. And that to me is the thing that I want to see continue, and I'm hoping that is the future of our industry, where it's like, this is community. We take care of each other. We protect each other. We look out for each other. We are this industry. We are the labor of this industry. And we are going to fight for each other, because like our strike would not have been the strike that it was if we didn't have Teamsters not crossing the picket line and allowing us to shut down productions. Our strike would not have been the way it was if SAG-AFTRA wasn't there with us since day one, and then vice versa, us still being there for them and us having a dual strike. Our strike would not be the way that it was if EATI members and writers assistant and script coordinators and TAG, the animation guild, them showing up, because our strike day 1 to day 148 looked the same. The amount of people that showed up every day, the people who donated food trucks, who donated waters, who came by to walk with us, who weren't even in the unions, regular citizens of Los Angeles and New York, people who flew in from places. I had people from around the world tuning into our strike and telling me on Twitter that they're paying attention. And so I'm just hoping that like that continues and we realize that like community, people, that's what makes the world go round. That's what's good storytelling, like
Mm-hmm.
it's about people, it's about heart, it's about love, it's about community. And like, let's please hold on to that and bring that into our scripts and our sets. And then that trickles down to like when a show and a movie is made with love and the audience receives that, like I just want that to just, that's my hope for the future.
Yes. I'm clapping. I don't even need to ask you what your philosophical musings or end with, our podcast with an inspiring thought on this topic is, because you just laid it out right now. I mean, unless you have one last thing you want to say before we end.
No, I have nothing else to say. I'm just really excited for people who see the possibilities. And I just so, like, I know we hear the bad, and I know we hear all of the like wrong in this industry. And here's the thing, like we all know what needs to be fixed, but like truly there's so many good people in this business, and there's so many good people in this business, and I'm excited to see the good people rise to the crop and be able to make their films. And that is what keeps me going. And I'm
Yes.
excited to see the future.
Yes. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. Our website is filmphilosophy.com. That's film and then philosophy with an F.com. On there you can find educational resources and our contact info. Our email is filmphilosophy.tme@gmail.com. And we love it when you send us audio messages by email so that we can play it back on our podcast. And if you're shy, a written email is perfectly fine as well. Hey guys, thanks so much for listening. We had so much fun with this topic that we kept talking after we wrapped the episode. So please enjoy some bonus content from our chat. You can find it on our website, filmphilosophy.com. Again, that is film and then philosophy with an F.com. This is Film Philosophy, and we'll see you next time.